The tactical world ended 40 yards past the lead Humvee. No sector, no support, no exfil, just green, violent, suffocating Kentucky brush slamming into the armored glass of the transport like it was trying to swallow the steel hull. We were sitting in a 40-ton reinforced war machine, flanked by 4 tactical vehicles designed to survive a war zone, and I couldn't even see the tail lights of the unit in front of me. That's when David Finley whispered, "Blake, the thermal sensors are flatlining. They aren't just cold, they're dead." People think a military ambush is all noise. Like the woods explode, the lead truck flips, and that's the end of the report. They're wrong. A real ambush doesn't rush you. It isolates you. It seeps through the comms, through the armor plating, and straight into your marrow. It turns $1 billion of tactical superiority into a pile of scrap metal and seasoned soldiers into terrified children. My name is Blake Ang, and we weren't supposed to take the detour. This convoy was an iron guard, reinforced hulls, 7.62 machine gun mounts, and a crew of specialists. David on engineering, Anna Munoz running point, and Harold Johnson on comms. We had a Class 5 cargo locked in the back and a direct line to base. On paper, this was an untouchable insertion. Then the mountain moved. A landslide carved out the interstate and the trees closed in like a biological blockade. Visibility dropped to the edge of the hood. The engines groaned. The radio died. And then the clicking started. Now we were sitting dead in the water in a place where being still is how you become a statistic. Outside the cab, the woods felt alive with a predator that knows our tactics better than we do. Inside, the temperature dropped until my old cold injuries began to throb with a phantom pain. But I'm telling you this because the government won't. They'll tell you it was a wildlife disturbance. They'll tell you your missing neighbors just got lost. If you care about the people sitting in your living room right now, you need to hear what happened when we finally pulled the triggers. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Don't let them bury your family in the dark like they tried to bury ours. Because somewhere beneath the sound of the idling engines, the pack was already moving in. The hum of the engine was a low, vibrating growl that I felt in my molars, a constant reminder of the 40 tons of classified hardware sitting right behind my head. But this time, I wasn't alone in the dark. Behind my rig, the high beams of 4 reinforced tactical vehicles cut through the Kentucky mist like searchlights in a war zone. We were 5 vehicles strong, 2 lead Humvees packed with heavy hitters, my central transport, and 2 rear security escorts bristling with mounted 7.62 machine guns. It was 0200, the hour where the soul starts to fray, and the shadows on the dashboard begin to look like reaching fingers. I gripped the wheel, my skin catching on the worn leather, my fingers rough and cracked from a lifetime of fighting the elements. My hands were shaking, just a hairline tremor that most wouldn't notice, but I knew it was there, a physical manifestation of the ghosts I've tried to outrun for 40 years. I looked over at David Finley, my co-pilot and engineer. He wasn't just looking at a tablet. He was managing a linked tactical network, his dark eyes darting across scrolling thermal data that connected every vehicle in the line. He looked up, and the pale blue light of the screen made his skin look like parchment. David didn't waste words. He was a man of cold efficiency, his dark eyes reading invisible data as if he were reading the heartbeat of the machine itself. "Oil pressure is stable, Blake," David said softly, his voice barely rising above the engine's drone. "But the weight in the back is shifting, heavier than the manifest says. Whatever is in that crate doesn't like the vibrations." I didn't answer. We all knew the manifest was a lie. You don't send a 5-vehicle iron guard into the Daniel Boone National Forest for surplus electronics. You do it for the kind of secrets that keep people like Anna Munoz awake at night. Anna, our expedition lead, was sitting in the jump seat behind us. Even after 6 hours on the road, her posture was as straight as a bayonet. Her blonde hair was pulled into braids so tight they looked painful, a practical crown for a woman who lived by the blade and the brush. She had a scar along her jawline, a thin white memory of a night she never talked about. When she spoke, the air in the cab seemed to tighten. "Stay on the clock, Blake," Anna commanded, her ice-blue eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "We have a window. If we miss the handoff at the checkpoint, it's not just our careers on the line. It's the safety of every civilian within a 50-mile radius of this forest. You think you're tired? Think about them. Think about your kids back in Safford. Think about what happens if this cargo gets loose because you were too tired to hold the line." That was Anna's way, emotional blackmail wrapped in tactical necessity. She knew I carried the weight of every person I'd ever lost on a transport run. She was leaning on my guilt, making sure I knew that if I faltered, if I let the fatigue win, the blood would be on my cracked hands. In the back, I could hear the rhythmic tapping of Harold Johnson's fingers against his comms console. Harold was the youngest, a lean kid whose shoulders still looked too narrow for the heavy tactical gear he was wearing. His brown hair was constantly flattened by his headset, and every time the truck hit a pothole, his wide eyes would reflect a fear he was too proud to admit. The cold hadn't hardened him yet, and his nervous energy showed in his hands, always tapping, rechecking, waiting for a signal that wasn't there. "Comms are scratchy, Anna," Harold stammered, his voice climbing an octave. "Base is fatting. It's probably just the limestone in the hills, but I'm getting some weird feedback. Sounds like rhythmic clicking." "Keep it tight, Johnson," Anna snapped, her voice leaving no room for doubt. "Check the secondary frequencies. We don't have the luxury of being out of touch when we're hauling something this volatile." I glanced back at Harold in the mirror. I wanted to tell him it was okay to be afraid, that the uniform didn't make him invincible, but I stayed silent. Anna was right about one thing. The load was too important. Whatever was in that lead-lined crate behind us was poolsing with a weight that felt wrong, a gravity that seemed to pull the very light out of the air. We were a wall of steel, 5 vehicles of high-intensity firepower moving through the ancient timber. But as we crossed the threshold into the deepest part of the forest, I realized that for all our armor and all our ammunition, we were just intruders in a place that didn't want us there. The trees were starting to look less like wood and more like a biological blockade, and the silence in the cab was about to be broken by a war we weren't ready to fight. The road ahead simply vanished, swallowed by a cascading wall of red Kentucky clay and splintered pine that looked like a raw wound in the earth. I slammed on the brakes, the massive rig groaning as the air brakes hissed like a dying animal, bringing 40 tons of secrets to a shuddering, violent halt just feet from the debris. In the high beams, the landslide wasn't just an obstacle. It was a total erasure of our exit strategy, cutting the 5-vehicle iron guard off from the interstate and the safety of the world we knew. "Anna, we're blocked," I said, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears as my scarred hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make the leather creak. "The mountain just took out the whole pass." Ana Munoz leaned forward, her ice-blue eyes scanning the tactical map on the console with a cold, predatory focus. She didn't look at the dirt, she looked at the ticking clock. "We can't wait for a road crew, Blake. If we don't make the handoff, the failure is on your head. Think about the people back in Safford. Think about your own kids, if this cargo gets loose because you were too paralyzed to take a detour." The emotional blackmail hit exactly where she intended, a sharp needle in an old wound. She was using my devotion to my family as a leash, dragging me toward a decision my gut was already rejecting. "There's a logging trail 3 miles back," Harold Johnson whispered, his voice trembling as he rechecked the navigation arrays. "Route 7. It's restricted, heavily wooded, but it loops around the slide and reconnects with the main artery 10 miles down." "It's a dead zone, Anna," David Finley interjected, his dark eyes never leaving the thermal monitor which was already showing strange, cold pockets in the surrounding tree line. "No cell service, no emergency turnoffs." And the canopy is so thick the satellites won't be able to track our signatures. We go in there, and we're officially off the grid. We're already off the grid, David, Anna snapped, her voice leaving no room for dissent as she tapped the glass of the dash. Blake, turn this rig around. We're taking Route 7. Unless, of course, you'd rather stay here and explain to the brass why you let the mission fail because you were scared of a few trees. I shifted into reverse, the backup camera showing the 4 tactical vehicles behind us mirroring my movements like a funeral procession. We reached the entrance to Route 7, a narrow, unpaved slit in the forest that looked more like a throat than a road. As the tires transitioned from smooth asphalt to the jarring, uneven crunch of gravel and old mud, the atmosphere in the cab shifted instantly. The trees here were ancient, their branches interlocking overhead to blot out the moon, leaving us entirely dependent on our own artificial lights. It felt like leaving the realm of man and entering something primal, a place where tactical superiority meant nothing and being still was a death sentence. "Harold, keep those comms open," I muttered, but the only response was a wall of static that sounded like dry bones rattling in a box. "I've got nothing, Blake," Harold said, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow as he adjusted his headset. "It's like the forest is absorbing the signal. I've never seen interference like this." Anna leaned back, her hand resting near the sidearm holstered at her hip, her silence more oppressive than the dark outside. She was watching me, measuring my fear, using the psychological weight of the mission to keep me from turning back. We were 3 miles into the deep timber when the temperature gauge on the dash began to plummet, 1 degree at a time, despite the heaters being on full blast. Outside, the darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical presence, heavy and expectant. And then, far off in the peripheral of our high beams, I saw the first flicker of something that shouldn't exist, a pair of yellow-green eyes, glowing with an internal fire that reflected nothing but the hunger of the woods. The yellow-green eyes in the peripheral weren't just watching, they were ranging us. I felt the air in the cab tighten, a pressure shift that signaled the end of the psychological standoff and the beginning of the kinetic war. Before I could even shout a warning over the internal comms, the night exploded. A massive, soot-colored shape launched from the interlocking canopy, hitting the lead Humvee with the force of a high-velocity kinetic penetrator. The 10,000-pound armored vehicle didn't just stop. It was shoved laterally into the mud, its reinforced suspension screaming as it nearly rolled into the black timber. "Contact front! Contact front!" Ana Munoz's voice was a whip crack, slicing through the freezing air as she hammered the release on her harness. She didn't look at the carnage. She looked at me, her ice-blue eyes pinning me to the driver's seat with a look that was more threat than command. "You do not stop, Blake. If you let this rig stall, you're not just killing us. You're murdering those boys in the lead vehicle by leaving them without cover. Do you want to be the coward who sat in a heated cab while his team got torn out of their boots? Drive." The emotional blackmail was a jagged blade, twisting in the gut of my survivor's guilt. She was using the lives of the men in that lead truck as a leash, dragging my foot toward the accelerator even as every instinct I possessed screamed for me to reverse. "Lead is immobile, they've lost the front axle," Harold Johnson screamed from the back, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep his headset on. "The rear escorts are dismounting. Anna, they're engaging." "Circled perimeter, now," Anna roared into her tactical mic as she kicked her door open. The woods erupted in a percussive, strobe-light hell. The security teams from the rear tactical vehicles didn't hesitate. They dismounted into the freezing mud, their boots hitting the gravel in a synchronized rhythm of professional violence. The high-pitched chatter of 5.56 rifles and the heavy, rhythmic thudding of the mounted 7.62 machine guns tore the silence of Route 7 into ribbons. Tracers cut through the thick Kentucky fog like glowing red needles, illuminating the upright, fur-covered shapes that were darting between the trees with a fluid, terrifying speed that defied the laws of biology. Suppressive fire, keep them off the glass, David Finley shouted, his fingers flying across the diagnostic tablet as he rerouted power to the external floodlights. The world outside the windshield became a blinding, white-hot stage. I watched through the spider-webbed glass as a dogman, 7 feet of corded muscle and soot-gray fur, charged the dismounted squad. It didn't run like an animal. It moved with a tactical zigzag, using the shadows of the ancient oaks as cover. The squad let out a wall of lead, the muzzle flashes casting long, jerky shadows against the biological blockade of the forest. I could smell the cordite now, sharp and metallic, clashing with the stagnant, predatory musk that was seeping into the cab through the vents. The temperature continued to plummet, turning the blood on the ground into slick, frozen patches. "They're flanking, Blake, they're moving to the rear." Harold's voice was a jagged edge of panic. He looked at me in the mirror, his wide eyes begging for an exit that didn't exist. "We're boxed in. Why aren't they stopping? They're running right into the fire." Anna stood in the V of her open door, her rifle bucking against her shoulder as she poured controlled bursts into the tree line. She turned her head just enough to catch my eye, her expression a mask of grim, tactical coldness. "They aren't stopping because they know we're afraid, Harold. Blake, if you don't steady those hands and hold this position, you're the one who's going to have to tell their mothers why they died in the mud for a coward's hesitation. Hold the line." I gripped the wheel, my scarred fingers aching, my vision tunneling on the lead Humvee as its turret gunner began to traverse his weapon toward a massive silhouette emerging from the dark. We were no longer a convoy. We were a fortress of steel and fire, and the gun battle was only just beginning. The percussive roar of the 7.62 mounts was deafening, but even through the thunder of the suppressive fire, the silence of the enemy was what truly chilled my blood. David Finley's fingers moved with a frantic, surgical precision across the diagnostic tablet, his face ghostly and translucent in the flickering violet light of the sensor array. The thermal feed was a chaotic smear of static. The predators were ghosting our tech, their body temperatures so low they registered as nothing more than holes in the atmosphere. "I can't get a lock, Blake," David shouted, his voice cracking as he bypassed the primary filters. "The software is looking for heat, but these things are sucking the energy right out of the air. They're invisible to the automated turrets." Outside, the squad was firing at shadows and movement, wasting precious brass on the thick Kentucky fog. I saw a tracer round skip off a tree trunk, illuminating a massive, upright silhouette for a fraction of a second before the darkness swallowed it again. The panic was starting to bleed into the squad's rhythm. The fire was becoming erratic, desperate. Ana Munoz slammed a fresh mag into her rifle, the metallic click sharp and final. She leaned over David's shoulder, her ice-blue eyes reflecting the violet static of the screen. "Fix it, David. If you don't find a way to give those gunners a target, the blood on the ground isn't just going to be from the lead vehicle. It'll be yours. It'll be Harold's. Do you want to be the reason this mission turns into a massacre because you couldn't calibrate a sensor?" The emotional blackmail was a heavy weight in the freezing cab, a direct assault on David's professional identity. She wasn't just asking for a technical fix. She was making him personally responsible for every life currently being risked in the mud. David flinched, but his eyes hardened as he dove into the raw code of the thermal array. "I'm flipping the spectrum," David muttered, his teeth beginning to chatter from the unnatural cold seeping through the floorboards. "If I can't find their heat, I'll track the cold voids they're leaving behind. I'm tagging the temperature drops." Suddenly, the monitor pulsed. The screen shifted from a chaotic mess of grays to a sharp, inverted map. Dark, obsidian-colored shapes began to bloom against the pale background of the forest. They were moving in a perfect tactical pincer, 4 of them flanking the rear Humvee while the commander held the center. "Thermal lock established," David yelled, his voice rising in a mixture of triumph and terror, linking the feed to the turret HUDs. Now. The change was instantaneous. The heavy thudding of the mounted machine guns shifted from blind suppressive sweeps to focused, rhythmic bursts. The tracers were no longer skipping off trees. They were finding their marks in the dark voids. I watched a 7.62 burst stitch across an obsidian shape in the tree line, sending a spray of dark, frozen fluid into the mist. Harold Johnson let out a choked sound of relief, but his wide eyes never left the window. "We can see them now, Anna. We can actually see them." "Don't get comfortable, Johnson," Anna hissed, her gaze never leaving the monitor. She looked at me, her expression a grim mask of calculation. "Blake, David just gave us a fighting chance, but those things are adapting. They're moving faster now that they know we've got a lock. If you don't keep this rig steady, the vibration will break the link. Do you hear me? One slip and we're back to fighting ghosts. Think about the guys in the lead. They're counting on your hands staying still." I gripped the steering wheel, my scarred fingers screaming in the cold, forcing the tremor in my chest to stay buried. We had the lock, but as the obsidian shapes on the screen began to sprint toward our perimeter with a fluid, terrifying speed, I realized that seeing the enemy was only the first step in surviving the war. The violet glow of the thermal monitor pulsed in sync with the percussive rhythm of the gun battle, but the obsidian shapes on the screen were closing the distance with a fluid, terrifying speed that mocked our tactical training. The air in the cab was so cold now that every breath felt like inhaling ground glass, and the smell of ozone and wet fur was thick enough to gag on. Outside, the world was a strobe-lit nightmare of muzzle flashes and gray fog, a high-stakes skirmish where the rules of biology had been discarded. "They're breaching the inner perimeter," David Finley shouted, his voice cracking as he adjusted the gain on the inverted sensors. "Lead Humvee's turret is jammed. They're crawling all over it. Blake, the rear left guard is pinned." I watched through the spider-webbed glass as a massive silhouette detached itself from the ancient oaks, moving with a tactical zigzag that ignored the wall of lead the squad was pouring into the tree line. This wasn't just a predator. It was a juggernaut of corded muscle and soot-gray fur, its yellow-green eyes burning with a mocking, internal fire. It was targeted on the rear escort, its elongated fingers reaching out like blackened steel talons. "Steady the rig, Blake," Ana Munoz roared, her ice-blue eyes fixed on the rear-facing camera. She didn't offer a word of comfort or a tactical plan. She reached for the emotional jugular. "If you let this truck drift an inch, the vibration will throw off the sniper's line. Think about the boy in that rear guard. He's Harold's age. If he dies because your hands are shaking like a coward, I'll make sure his mother knows it was your weakness that killed him. Hold the line." The emotional blackmail was a jagged blade twisting in the gut of my survivor's guilt. She was using the life of a kid I didn't even know to anchor my scarred, aching hands to the wheel. I forced the tremor in my chest into a cold, hard knot of desperation. In the back of the rearmost Humvee, Sergeant Martin, our designated marksman, was positioned in the V of the armored hatch. I could see the red dot of his laser sight dancing across the fog, searching for a gap in the biological blockade. The creature was 30 yards out. 20. It leaped over a fallen log with an impossible grace, its snout opening to reveal rows of serrated teeth. "Target locked," Martin's voice crackled over the dead air of the comms, sounding more like a machine than a man. "Take it," Anna hissed. The shot wasn't like the chatter of the machine guns. It was a single, heavy crack that seemed to punch a hole in the very atmosphere. The 7.62 round, a specialized high-velocity penetrator, found its mark with surgical precision. On the thermal monitor, I watched the obsidian void of the creature's head erupt in a spray of violet-white heat. The impact was massive, the force of the kinetic energy snapping the creature's neck backward as its skull shattered like a porcelain bowl. The juggernaut didn't just fall, it was deleted from the world. It hit the mud with a heavy, wet thud, sliding several feet through the freezing slush before coming to a stop. For a fraction of a second, the gun battle in that sector ceased. The other shadows in the tree line went still, a collective pause of shock that rippled through the pack. "Confirmed kill. One down," Harold Johnson screamed, a hysterical edge of triumph breaking through his panic. He looked at me in the mirror, his wide eyes searching for validation. "We killed it, Blake. We proved they can bleed." "Don't celebrate yet, Johnson," Anna snapped, her gaze never leaving the monitor as the silver-gray commander atop the wreckage let out a deep, rhythmic clicking. She turned to me, her expression a grim mask of calculation. "We just proved we can hurt them, which means that commander out there is about to stop playing. Blake, Martin just gave you a window. If you don't use it to prep this rig for a breakout, you're spitting on that headshot. Do you want to be the one who wasted our only tactical advantage?" I gripped the wheel, my scarred fingers screaming in the cold, but for the first time since the landslide, the shaking had stopped. We had bled them. The illusion of their invincibility was lying in the mud of Route 7, and as the silver-gray commander raised its hand for a secondary wave, I realized the war had truly begun. The silver-gray commander standing atop the wreckage of the lead Humvee didn't howl in grief for its fallen soldier. It let out a series of sharp, rhythmic clicks that sounded like bone snapping against bone. It was a tactical command, cold and precise, and the forest responded with a violence that made the previous skirmish look like a training exercise. From the obsidian voids of the thermal monitor, a dozen new signatures emerged, moving in a coordinated mass charge that ignored the concept of self-preservation. The woods didn't just move. They exploded as the pack lunged from the biological blockade, their yellow-green eyes streaks of fire in the freezing mist. "Mass charge, all sectors weapons free." Ana Munoz's voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the sudden roar of the secondary wave. She slammed her hand against the dash, her ice-blue eyes fixed on me with a terrifying intensity. "Blake, if you let your foot lift off that pedal now, you're not just a driver, you're an executioner. Look at Harold. Look at how he's shaking. If we don't hold this perimeter, the last thing he'll see is one of those things peeling him out of his seat. Is that the memory you want to carry? That you gave up when the kid needed you to be a man?" The emotional blackmail was a suffocating weight, a direct assault on my protective instincts that left no room for my own terror. She was using Harold's life as a bartering chip, forcing me to anchor the rig in the center of a hellscape while my scarred hands throbbed with the phantom cold of the Boone. Outside, the air became a solid wall of lead. The 7.62 mounts on the rear escorts were glowing orange, the barrels screaming as they poured a sustained stream of fire into the charging mass. I watched through the spider-webbed glass as a Dogman was shredded by a concentrated burst, its chest cavity erupting in a violet-white bloom on the monitor, but it didn't stop until the third hit took off its shoulder. They were coming from the trees, the ground, and even leaping from the upper branches of the ancient oaks, hitting the armored roofs of our convoy with the force of falling boulders. "They're swarming the rear right," David Finley yelled, his fingers dancing over the thermal array to prioritize targets for the gunners. "The sensors are overloading. There's too much movement. Blake, the heat from the barrels is masking their signatures." "Override the filters and keep shooting," Anna roared, her rifle bucking as she fired through the open V of the door. She turned to me, blood from the small cut on her jaw now a frozen smear. "Think about your family, Blake. You think the military is going to take care of them if you fail? They'll erase you. They'll tell your kids you died of negligence in a ditch. The only way you ever walk through your front door again is if you drive us through this pack. Do you hear me? Drive us through them." The psychological pressure was a vice, tightening with every impact against the hull of the rig. I could hear the metal groaning as claws found purchase in the reinforced plating, the screech of tearing steel a physical pain in my ears. Harold was curled in a ball at his station, his hands clamped over his ears, his wide eyes reflecting the muzzle flashes that turned the cab into a strobe-lit nightmare. "Contact, they're on the glass," Harold screamed, as a massive, soot-colored head slammed against the driver's side window. The creature's yellow-green eyes were inches from mine, burning with a mocking, human-like intelligence that saw right through my uniform and my history. It didn't growl. It clicked, a rhythmic, taunting sound that vibrated through the reinforced pain. I gripped the wheel, my cracked fingers locking into place, as the secondary wave turned the logging trail into a slaughterhouse of cordite and wet fur. The woods had truly exploded, and as the commander raised its blackened steel talons for the final push, I realized that surviving the ambush meant becoming as cold and relentless as the things trying to kill us. The heavy thud of a body hitting the armored roof sent a fresh wave of dust from the ceiling panels, but it was drowned out by the localized thunder of the rear Humvee's turret. Through the strobe-lit chaos of the windshield, I saw Sergeant Martin's laser designator cut a sharp, red line through the freezing Kentucky mist. The silver-gray commander was still perched atop the wreckage of the lead vehicle, clicking out orders that sent the pack into a frenzy, but his flank was open for a fraction of a second. David Finley's fingers were a blur as he isolated the temperature void of a second Dogman, a massive, scarred brute that was currently trying to peel the door off the trailing escort. Martin, lock established. Sector 4, Mark III. David's voice was a jagged scream of adrenaline. On the inverted thermal monitor, the obsidian void of the second target pulsed as the software centered the crosshairs. I see him, Martin's voice crackled over the comms, cold and mechanical. Engaging. The single, heavy crack of the sniper rifle echoed through the woods, followed instantly by a spray of violet-white heat on the screen. The Dogman's head snapped back, the 7.62 high-velocity round punching through the skull with enough force to send shards of bone into the mud behind it. The creature collapsed in a heap of tangled limbs and soot-colored fur, its yellow-green eyes extinguishing as it hit the ground. Two down, we got another one. Harold Johnson's voice broke into a hysterical, high-pitched laugh, a sound of pure psychological fracture. He looked at me, his face pale and slick with sweat despite the sub-zero air. "Blake, did you see that? We're killing them. We're actually winning." Ana Munoz grabbed Harold's shoulder, her grip so tight her knuckles turned white. She didn't let him enjoy the moment. "Winning? Look at the perimeter, Johnson." She leaned over the seat, her ice-blue eyes boring into mine, utilizing the raw terror of the moment to forge a new chain of obligation. "Blake, 2 kills aren't a victory, they're an invitation. That pack is realizing they can't play with us anymore, and that commander is about to sacrifice every soldier he has to stop this rig. If you don't find a way to break through that biological wall now, you're spitting on Martin's aim. You want those 2 kills to be the only thing they write in your obituary? Or do you want to be the man who actually got his crew home?" The emotional blackmail was a crushing weight. She was framing our tactical success as a ticking clock, turning the confirmed kills into a reason for more desperation. Outside, the silence that followed the second kill lasted only a heartbeat before the clicking returned, louder and more rhythmic than before. The pack wasn't retreating. They were tightening the circle. I watched through the side mirror as 3 massive silhouettes leaped onto the hood of the rear escort, their claws screeching against the reinforced steel. The turret gunner screamed as a blackened hand reached through the hatch, dragging him into the dark. "They're overwhelming the rear. We're losing the perimeter," David yelled, his thermal feed becoming a solid wash of obsidian shapes. "Blake, the 7.62 barrels are glowing white. They're going to melt if we don't move." "You heard him, Blake," Anna hissed, her face inches from mine, the smell of cordite and wet fur thick on her breath. "Think about your kids. Think about the fact that right now, they're sleeping in a world that doesn't know what a Dogman is. If you die here, that world ends for them. You're the only thing standing between your family and the things in these trees. Do you have the spine to ram through them, or are you going to let Harold be the next one dragged through a hatch?" I looked at Harold, who was staring at the empty comm screen, his spirit already broken. I gripped the wheel, my scarred, aching fingers finally locking into a cold, hard resolve that mirrored Anna's. The weight of the 2 dead creatures and the dying gunner pressed down on my soul, but the need to survive was heavier. I shifted the rig into low range, the engine screaming as the turbochargers spun up. The second kill hadn't saved us. It had just stripped away the last of our illusions. The 7.6 tomb barrels on the rear escorts were glowing a lethal, translucent orange, and the smell of melting grease and overheated steel began to fill the cab. I looked through the spider-webbed windshield at the biological wall, a literal blockade of fur and muscle standing between us and the only road out. The silver-gray commander was no longer watching from the wreckage. It had dropped to all fours, leading a mass charge directly toward my front bumper. My hands, once ruined by the cold and shaking with the weight of old failures, suddenly clamped onto the steering wheel with the rigidity of iron. "The rear sensors are gone, Blake. They've neutralized the trailing unit," David Finley screamed, his dark eyes fixed on a thermal monitor that was now nothing but a chaotic sea of obsidian shapes. "The pincer is closed. If we don't break the center, we're just meat in a tin can." Ana Munoz didn't look at the sensors. She looked at me, her ice-blue eyes boring into the side of my head, her voice a low, terrifying vibration that cut through the thunder of the gun battle. "This is it, Blake. This is the moment you decide if you're a father or a ghost. Look at Harold. He's already given up. If you don't find the nerve to ram that line, you're not just failing the mission, you're murdering that boy. Do you want to go to your grave knowing you let a 22-year-old die because you were too afraid to floor the engine? Do you want your kids to find out their dad was the reason a tactical squad got erased in the Boone?" The emotional blackmail was a physical weight, a jagged hook in my soul that left no room for hesitation. She was using my protective instincts to turn me into a weapon. I shifted the 40-ton rig into high range, the transmission slamming into place with a violent jolt. I floored the accelerator, and the turbochargers let out a high-pitched, mechanical scream that rivaled the unnatural howls of the pack. "Brace, everyone brace," I roared, the words feeling like they were being dragged over broken glass. The rig surged forward, the speedometer needle jumping from 0 to 80 in a heartbeat. We hit the first wave of the biological wall at 100 km/h. The impact was sickening, a rhythmic, heavy thudding of bodies against the reinforced steel bumper, followed by the terrifying screech of bone and sinew being ground beneath 40 tons of momentum. The windshield was instantly coated in a thick, dark fluid that turned violet on the thermal sensors. "They're leaping for the cab. Blake, don't slow down," David yelled, his face pale as a massive shape slammed into the roof, the metal buckling inward just inches from his head. Through the chaos, I saw the silver-gray commander standing its ground in the middle of the logging trail, its yellow-green eyes locked onto mine. I didn't flinch. I pushed the needle to 130 km/h, the entire rig vibrating so violently it felt like the bolts were going to shear off. The hum of the engine was a roar of pure desperation. We hit the commander head-on. The shockwave of the impact nearly threw me from my seat, and for a split second, the world was nothing but the sound of grinding metal and the visceral reality of a predator being deleted by mechanical force. We're through the center," Harold Johnson screamed, his voice breaking as he watched the treeline blur into a streak of dark green and gray. We were hurtling down Route 7 at a suicidal speed, the rear escort still pouring suppressive fire into the woods behind us to keep the flanking shadows at bay. The steering wheel was a bucking animal in my hands, fighting me at every curve, but I didn't let up. My scarred fingers ached, and my vision tunneled on the narrow strip of gravel ahead. Anna leaned back, her hand finally moving away from her sidearm, her ice-blue eyes never leaving my face. "You did it, Blake. You chose to live. Just remember, the things you did to get us through that wall, they stay here. The military doesn't pay us to be heroes, they pay us to be silent." She was already setting the stage for the psychological cage that would follow the battle. I didn't answer. I just kept my foot pinned to the floor, the smell of cordite and wet fur clinging to my clothes like a second skin, as the lights of civilization began to flicker in the far distance. We had broken the wall, but as I looked in the mirror at the wreckage we left behind, I knew the war was far from over. The floodlights of the Safford checkpoint were a brutal, artificial white that stripped the shadows from the mud and made the blood on the rig's grill look like black oil. I brought the transport to a shuddering halt, the engine clicking and ticking as it cooled, its mechanical heart exhausted from the 130 km/h sprint through hell. The silence that followed was heavy, not the peaceful silence of the woods, but the suffocating quiet of a tomb. Behind us, the surviving tactical vehicles limped into the light, their armor shredded and their turrets smoking, ghosts of the Iron Guard we had started with. The cab door was ripped open by men in sterile, dark uniforms. They didn't have mud on their boots or terror in their eyes. They moved with a cold, bureaucratic efficiency, pulling David Finley and Harold Johnson out before I could even find my voice. I stepped down onto the gravel, my legs nearly buckling, my scarred hands shaking with a violence I could no longer hide. I looked back at the front of the truck, at the matted fur and the deep, structural dents where we had deleted the commander, and I felt a surge of grim validation. We had bled them. We had proof. "Sit down, Blake," Ana Munoz said, her voice appearing at my shoulder like a phantom. She wasn't looking at the truck. She was looking at a man in a crisp suit who was standing by a blacked-out SUV. Her ice-blue eyes were no longer tactical. They were empty. "The debrief is starting. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The debrief didn't happen in an office. It happened in a cramped, windowless trailer smelling of stale coffee and ozone. The man in the suit didn't ask about the Dogmen. He didn't ask about the way they used pincer movements or the clicking commands of the silver-gray Alpha. He laid a single piece of paper on the table, a non-disclosure agreement with a header I'd never seen before. "The report will state that the convoy encountered a massive landslide and a subsequent fuel line explosion," he said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "The casualties in the lead and rear vehicles are being attributed to equipment failure and environmental hazards. There was no gun battle. There were no creatures. And there were certainly no kills." "No kills," I rasped, the word tasting like copper. "We took 2 of their heads off. Martin's got it on the thermal feed. I felt the commander shatter against my bumper. It's all over the front of the rig." The man leaned in, his shadow stretching across the table. "What rig, Blake? The transport is currently being scrubbed and repainted. The thermal data was corrupted by atmospheric interference. And Sergeant Martin is being reassigned to a post where he'll forget he ever held a rifle." He paused, letting the silence do the work. "Think about your children, Blake. If you insist on telling horror stories, the military will have no choice but to declare you psychologically unfit. Your pension, gone. Your reputation, erased. Do you want your kids to grow up with a father who's locked in a ward, screaming about monsters that don't exist?" It was the final piece of emotional blackmail, the ultimate leverage. They were using the very family I had fought to save to ensure I never spoke the truth. I looked at Ana, hopping for a spark of the woman who had roared commands in the cab, but she just stared at the table. She had already signed. She had chosen survival over the truth. I signed the paper. The pen felt like a lead weight. That was 6 years ago. They think they erased it. They think that by painting over the blood and shredding the thermal logs, they've made the Boones safe again. But I'm telling you this now because I can still feel the vibration of the commander hitting the bumper. I still hear the rhythmic clicking in my dreams. If you're listening to this, you need to understand. The government isn't just hiding the monsters. They're hiding the fact that we can actually fight back. So, if you're driving through the Daniel Boone and the road vanishes, or if your GPS tells you to take a detour onto a restricted logging trail, don't. Turn the car around. Because those things in the woods don't care about your NDAs and they don't care about the truth. They only care about the hunt. Respect the darkness, but never trust the light at the checkpoint. Because sometimes the people who claim to protect you are the ones who have already decided you're a ghost. Hit the subscribe button and stay in the light. Because out there in the Boone, the brass is always hot, and the enemy is always waiting for the next routine transport.